So which are the meanest and greenest Ork units around, and which ones are fairly zogging useless? Let's rank the Ork units in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Orks, and now a few people have had a chance to experiment with the new codex. I thought it would be worth trying to do a rough tier list, talking about which units are most powerful and which units are maybe slightly less so. With that in mind, within my own estimation, I've ranked them into 4 different tiers, starting with tier 4 the weakest, and moving forward towards tier 1 which I've ranked the strongest. Obviously tier lists are always a little bit arbitrary, and it certainly depends on what sort of clan you're playing or what kind of build you're going for. Plus the book hasn't been out all that long yet, so it may well be that I've ranked some things a little bit too high or too low. If you do disagree with anything, please let us know down in the comments below, and I'll put a pinned comment with a few corrections in if you do convince me that I've ranked anything wrong. With all that being said, let's jump straight into it. We'll start with tier 4, and we'll go through each datasheet in the codex and why I've ranked it where I have. First up in tier 4, I've ranked just the 2 datasheets, ones that I'd very rarely imagine people would use in competitive lists. The first one of those is the Mechboy Workshop. I just don't really see this being worth it for the 70 odd points. Its main function is that it allows mechs to heal 1 extra wound on a vehicle per turn, allows you to double up on custom jobs, and allows mechs to amp up 1 vehicle with a custom job halfway through the game. Maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on it, it's certainly a really fun model to have included, and perhaps it could be an interesting way of getting a custom job in play that might have been a few too many points to warrant including. I'm just really not convinced that the 70 points is going to be worth it though, compared with just including either more mechs or more vehicles to start with. The 70 points could get you almost an entire extra mech or entire extra buggy, and I'd almost certainly want to go that way myself. The other unit that I put in tier 4 is the Gun Wagon, a battle wagon with a kill cannon on top that's a bit more accurate, but unfortunately if you compare it to just about any other source of Ork firepower in the decks, it's just so disappointingly underwhelming even when you give it the custom job Daboomer. I guess it is pretty tough, but I think that you're really going to want to take this instead of things like Bone Breakers, Hunter Rigs or Kill Rigs. It just seems incredibly points inefficient, I'm afraid. Moving on to tier 3 where I'm a bit more positive, I think that the majority of these units are usable, just not quite as standout as some of the other units up the list. First up we have Gretchen, which I must admit I found a little bit difficult to rank, as I kind of feel that they're likely to be in quite a lot of Ork lists, purely for filling detachments and being the cheapest troops choice that you can throw on objectives, still having OBSEC with that horrible Gits rule. I think they'll certainly still be used, but I think they're really quite underwhelming compared with a lot of other factions' chaff infantry. You really don't want to compare a 5-point Gretchen to say an Imperial Guardsman or a Poxwalker. They have worse damage, durability and leadership than any of these, despite being roughly the same cost. Next up we have the Stomper, which has certainly been improved a fair stretch since the last decks, though I guess the only way that it could go was up. With a drastically lower points cost it does seem a lot more efficient, plus having a flat damage 9 claw is really quite fun. I still think that they might be still a bit more in the fun and fluffy sort of section of Orks as opposed to a top tier competitive thing, but who knows, maybe we'll see someone make them work. Next up we come to Morkanauts and Gorkanauts, newly moved to the Lord of War slot and now kind of a bit more equivalent to mini knights as opposed to heavy dreadnoughts. They are at least relatively cheap for the damage that they do in close combat, though with the sheer amount of heavy anti-tank firepower in 9th edition, I'm just not enormously convinced that they're going to live long enough to do enough damage. Being Lords of War just doesn't really help them all that much either. You're going to have to sacrifice a bunch of command points if you want to run any more than one. Moving on we have the Looters, which are certainly a unit that I could have been persuaded to put in tier 2, and perhaps I should have. They certainly got better with the new codex, going up to toughness 5, dropping in points, and being able to fire their def guns on the move with an extra shot at half range. They are still pretty fragile if they don't have either a truck or some other vehicle to hide in, and despite their efficiency upgrades, I do feel that they perhaps lost out a bit in the change to the new codex, as they were a really big shooting unit that could make great use of some of the Ork stratagems, like firing twice with Bad Moons. In my comparison of Orky firepower that I'll link down in the video description, they kind of come out okay against most targets, though aren't particularly stand out against anything. Next we have the Werboy, the Beast Snagger Weird Boy alternative, who has to draw his powers from the Beast Head discipline. I do feel that we're very rarely going to see this guy run, just because this guy costs 70 points, and if you want Beast Head psychic powers, I'd much rather include it on the Kill Rig, which sure is all the way up to 190 points, but you just get so much more for the points invested. I think if I were to include an Ork Psyker on foot, I'd much rather take the Weird Boy. Fist of Gork, Dad Jump and Warpath are all great spells, and they outcompete the majority of spells on the Beast Head discipline in my opinion. Mega Knobs, I must admit, I was surprisingly underwhelmed with in the new codex. They did go up to toughness 5, and they certainly are a big meaty unit that you could build around, but again they just don't seem enormously stand out compared with some of the other choices. I think lacking an invul save really does hurt these guys, particularly as for a similar points cost you could be fighting things like Death Guard Terminators who have -1 damage and a 4+ invul save built in, and I was a bit disappointed that their extra damage stratagem did go up to 2 command points this time, making it far less attractive. I might be underrating these guys. They're certainly a good way of concentrating greenskin force into one big unit. They're certainly a unit that I could have been persuaded to put up in tier 2. Moving on, we come to Death Dreads and Killer Cans, who I feel both might have their place in an Ork list, though again don't seem enormously stand out compared with other choices. Killer Cans could be a good nuisance unit. They have got 3 attacks and they hit on 4s now with their damage 3 can claws, and could provide a little bit of accurate shooting to boot. Death Dreads are maybe a little bit more tempting on the melee side of things. I was a bit disappointed that they lost some custom jobs like the sparkly bits for the extra +1 to hit. I don't really feel like either of them are particularly bad choices, but when you have some incredibly cheap buggies running around that can do a decent bit of melee as well as much heavier firepower, it does seem kind of hard to justify these. Next we have the Burner and the Blitzer Bomber, both of which are kind of similar, the main difference being different types of bombs that they can drop on the enemy. I lump them both into being kind of okay Ork flyers. I feel like the other two do outcompete them. I must admit it was a bit of a shame that the Burner Bomber lost the flying Ebbutt stratagem to turn the whole thing into a massive flying bomb to nuke the middle of the enemy force. There doesn't seem anything too wrong with them though if you do want a bit of a bomber type threat unit to accompany a Ork mechanized list. Knobs remain really quite a flexible and customizable unit at the price of being a little bit of a premium choice compared with standard boys, and perhaps the best use of them might be tooling them all up with big choppers, where you can run whole squads of them at 21 points per model if you want to. I guess they might be taken a little bit more in the new codex, seeing as Ork leadership is quite as bad as it is, and that kind of incentivizes small squads just that bit more. Still not sure that they're amazingly competitive though compared with some of the other choices. Finally, I've chosen to rank a few of the characters here, including the Runtherd and Zogrod Wartsnagger. I think that these guys would have a bit more of a place if Gretchen spam became a thing, but seeing as I can only see most people taking 1 or 2 units of Gretchen in a list at the most, I'm not sure it's really worth investing entire characters to support them on top of that. I think I'd just let them fail leadership, maybe lose a grot or 2, and not worry about trying to make that better. For Zogrod, I wish that he had a better ability to augment the Gretchen. Just giving them +1 to hit just doesn't really seem enough to make them into a credible threat. I also chose to rank the Knob with the War Banner here. He's the one that gives a +1 to hit in melee for all friendly Ork units within 6 inches. In general, I'd rather take the War Boss for the same purposes. He does that for core and character units, and of course you get a massive fighty War Boss included for the price, rather than a fairly slow and underwhelming melee character in the Knob. I think he could still have some niche uses though, if you want to support anything with a +1 to hit in combat that doesn't have the core keyword. Maybe could be good alongside some vehicles or something. Finally for tier 3, and certainly units that I'd put at the top end of tier 3, maybe nosing into tier 2, will be the Battle Wagons and the Bone Breakers. Big chunky Ork transports that can hold quite a lot of boys, a good delivery system for things like burner boys, and potentially a shooting pillbox for Orky firepower. The Death Roller can certainly make them into a credible melee threat as well, though I think it will be interesting to see whether it shakes out people taking more of these things, or going down the Beast Snagger route a bit more, taking things like kill rigs, and maybe some of the very point efficient buggies. I kind of find them a bit of a hard one to rate, as how good they are really does depend on how effective their contents are. Next up we're moving into tier 2, and some solid competitive picks for the Orks, though I've saved tier 1 for the absolute best of the best. First up, Burner Boys are enormously improved compared with previously. They finally have the full D6 shots on their flamers, went up to toughness 5, and if you're looking for a fairly close range shooty option for boys, they seem like a reasonable pick. I'd rather take these over shooter boys pretty much any day of the week. They can use their cut in flame in close combat for a command point, so can turn into a pretty decent melee unit when they need to. I guess that one of the biggest niggles with them is having to take the mech with the custom Mega Blaster or other ranged weapon. It's a shame that you can't just load up entirely on burners. Next up we have the fancy new Deathcopters that come in the Combat Patrol box. I'd say they're perhaps one of the more improved units out of the new Ork Codex, now getting 2d3 rocket shots on the move, innate deep strike, and also the benefit of that new Ramshackle rule, which certainly helps against damage 2 weapons. Deathcopters seem pretty excellent for harassing and flanking type maneuvers, and can be a really interesting source of getting a charge out of deep strike by putting them in deep strike and then using that ramming speed stratagem to nearly guarantee a charge. I think they're certainly a very solid unit, but they do face some very stiff competition within the fast attack, from things like the Squigog Boys, Boggies and Warbikers. Next we have Ork Boys, which I was debating on whether to put in Tier 1 or Tier 2. I think it might depend on your army list, and whether you're willing to build around them to some extent. Between the boys and the Beast Snagger Boys, I feel like it's a bit of a toss-up at the moment. For the extra 2 points, getting the Strength 5 and 6 plus invul save does seem about balanced compared with how much extra you spend. In general, big mobs of 30 I think just aren't anywhere near as viable as they used to be. The mob rule change really punished boys, and it means that they're actually affected by morale to quite a big extent now. So if you take a few casualties, you're nearly guaranteed to take a fair bunch more, unless you're willing to spend 2 command points. I think that in general, boys might be used as more small 10-man units now, maybe jumping out of transports or using other things to deliver them, where they're still very efficient in melee, and toughness 5 keeps them a bit safer than they used to be. In the end I chose to rank them in Tier 2, just because I don't think that they're necessarily an auto-include for orcs anymore, which kind of says something seeing as they're the main troops choice and are far more efficient than Gretchen. Still though, I'm by no means saying that they're a bad unit, really strong and can dole out an enormous amount of hurt. Next up we have the mech guns, which I think have been changed in battlefield role a little bit since 8th. You can't spam them as easily, the custom mega cannon seems to be the way to go, but due to their incredibly poor leadership, I think you're usually going to want to field them in 1s or maybe 2s at most, and just have a few of them sat around at the back of the army, dealing out a bit of firepower. For the points investment and the toughness to remove, I think they really are quite efficient. I think it's really going to be a wrong choice to take 2 or 3 custom mega cannons just to camp at the back of your army, but we're not going to see people spamming crazy amounts of them like they used to. Moving on, we have the Hunter Rig, which seems to be a pretty excellent transport for the Beast Snaggers if you do want to run a mob or 2 of Beast Snagger boys with some of their characters on foot. It's really quite tough for the 160 points, being toughness 8 and having 16 wounds. Will do pretty decent work in melee with those horns and saws and things, a little bit of shooting and being able to slow a unit each turn, and of course having an improved transport capacity compared with the Kill Rig. It is really quite an efficient transport I think, I just think that it might well be outcompeted by the Kill Rig. As for an extra 30 points for 2 psychic spells and the powerful Word Tower shooting upgrade, I think that people are usually going to be drawn to the Kill Rig instead. Next we come to the Big Ed Boss Bunker, the new Orky fortification that seems to be most efficient as a gun platform for certain fragile Ork units. It's really very tough indeed for the points invested, and it seems like the perfect companion for things like tank busters, flash gits and looters. Load them up inside this thing, and then you can potentially teleport it into battle, guaranteeing you an alpha strike, and then giving you a really resilient fortification that the enemy has to chew through if they want to get to the fragile boys inside. It even does a little bit of shooting itself, which is nice as well. Maybe terrain placement is the biggest issue, with that rule about fortifications having to set up greater than 3 inches away, but provided it can be deployed in a reasonable selection of locations, I think that this could be a really interesting shooting option. Next we have the pricey Ork Flyer in the Wasbomb Blaster Jet. Significantly more points cost than the other flyers, but also significantly heavier firepower as well. It's really quite powerful to have this thing just be able to swoop into the enemy backlines, then open up with a massive 7 shots at damage D3 plus 3, all hitting on a 4 plus as it's piloted by a mech. The force field's also an interesting option as well. You could maybe have one of these alongside a bunch of Dakka jets and make them more annoying to remove with a 5 plus invul save, provided they fly in formation. The main downside is the points cost. You lose quite a lot if your opponent can shoot this down turn 1, but it certainly gives them a threat that they really want to deal with as soon as possible. Next we come to the flash gits, where their snaz guns went to heavy 3 shots, strength 6 AP-2, damage 2, and all hitting on 4s innately. I'd say if they didn't have their stratagem they might be a bit more average, but I think it's really quite powerful that they do have the option to fire twice. 2 command points for potentially an extra 30 strength 6 shots is really quite crazy, even if you are limited to the second volley being at the closest visible unit. If you have command points to spare, they might be some of the most efficient Ork firepower around, and could get particularly nasty if you do field them in freebooters and you manage to activate the +1 to hit. Next up we have 3 of the Orktober buggies, the Shock Jump Dragster, Boomdacker Snazwagon and Custom Booster Blaster. I'd argue that these guys perhaps aren't on the top-notch performance that the Squig Buggies and the Scrap Jets are, but are still very efficient shooting units in their own right, being a lot tougher with Ramshackle and the option to get a -1 to hit if they need it. The Dragster's teleport redeployment move could be really annoying and quite crucial if you want to hunt down a few fleeing enemy units. The Snazwagon's got kind of okay generalist firepower, but is particularly hard to remove as it's got a native -1 to hit. And the custom booster blaster maybe arguably has some of the most dangerous shooting out of any of the buggies, but you do have to get up close to activate its burner exhausts, which only have an 8-inch range. If you do though, an average of 14 strength 4 auto hits really is not at all bad for an 80-point model, never mind its rivet cannon. Next up we have the Tank Busters, another relatively fragile Ork shooting unit. Now their rockets have gone up to heavy D3, so they're fairly bad on the move, but still some of the most potent firepower against tanks. Perhaps one reason that I think that they outperform the looters a little bit is because they have some really good synergy with that boss bunker and teleporting, as if you have them embarked in a boss bunker, they always count as having remained stationary. That means that you could teleport them into battle, and you could have an entire mob of tank busters firing with an average of 2 shots each, or 3 shots each if they fire at anything that's 6 models or more, and they'll all be hitting on 5s despite having heavy weapons. For around 250 points, that just seems like a ludicrously scary threat to be ready to drop on the opponent. Finally for tier 2 here, I have chosen just to lump in the vast majority of Ork characters. All of these I think are good options in the right circumstances, and a lot of the generic ones get even better when they're tooled up with the right warlord traits and relics. I just wouldn't say that any one of them is necessarily as an auto-include as a certain beast boss on Squigosaur is, as we'll mention in tier 1. Just to run through them briefly, I think that Deathkiller War Trikes are kind of fine for what you get, a decent choice if you want a speed war for the extra AP on all your buggies, though it is a bit of a shame that they don't provide any real leadership in themselves. The Knob on Smasher Squig is really cheap, and nets you a decent amount of mortal wound impact hits, so it's quite a scary threat to have lurking in your forces. The Pain Boy, Pain Boss and Mad Dog Grotsnig are all just slight different variations on the 6+ Feel No Pain. It just depends whether you want to go for the basic option for the cheapest version, or invest a little bit more to have them a bit more fighty, or a bit faster in terms of the Pain Boss with his hopping legs. The Pain Boss is a bit more limited to only healing beef snaggers as well, so that does limit his uses just a bit. We then have the Beast Boss, the Standard War Boss and the War Boss on bike, all of which can be very scary combat monsters with the right relics and warlord traits. Brutal but cunning is particularly nice on these, and they'd really enjoy being souped up by a weird boy with the fists of Gork. For the big mechs, I think that both versions with a custom force field can be handy. They're maybe not quite as much as previous, now it's only a 6+ invul rather than a 5+, but they'll be there to fix up some buggies and things, and you can make a surprisingly shooty build as well with the dead shiny shooter and the teleport blaster on the big mech with mega armor. I'm maybe not quite as convinced on the shock attack gun this edition. It's nice that it hits on a 4 now and that it can't be directly targeted by enemy units, but in terms of the firepower for the points invested, it's just really not all that strong. Weird Boys I think are good value provided you've got the right units to buff them with, and particularly if you've got enough boys around that they can cast 2 powers. Dead Jump, Warpath and Fist of Gork are all great spells, particularly the last one to make a very dangerous character even more dangerous. I've chosen to rank Ghazghkull here as well. He's certainly an enormous threat, and is almost guaranteed to cause the opponent some problems, seeing as he can only take 4 wounds per phase. I really quite like his ability to call both the War and the Speed War together. Could be really handy for certain units that like both, like Warbikes or Deathcopters. I do feel like he kind of costs an appropriate amount of points for what he does though. You certainly want some decent return on your investment if you're sinking 300 points into one HQ choice. Finally we have Boss Zagstruck, Snickrot and Badrock, and they all seem pretty reasonable for the Goths, Blood Axes and Freebooters respectively. Zagstruck's a little more efficient now his claws can be used on any attacks now, they're not limited, and the Goths' culture got improved as well too. Snickrot can set up in the midfield and is pretty efficient alongside commandos, and Badrock can give a nice reroll 1's aura for shooting if you are looking to build around a powerful freebooters shooting army. I think they're all okay, but they will struggle to outcompete the generic choices souped up with relics and warlord traits. Finally, we're getting into the really good stuff, and tier 1 is where I've placed some of the units that I think will be really common picks in competitive Ork armies. First up, I have decided to rank the Truck here, though I'm mainly ranking it here due to Truck Boys, not necessarily just for the datasheet itself. For a transport it's fairly effective, nice and cheap at 70 points, good movement and the ramshackle rule to keep it a bit safer, but it just gives the boys mobs inside a crazy threat range, being able to disembark after movement and still shoot and make a charge. First turn charges are easily in the remit of Truck Boys, and they seem like great options for just slingshotting boys towards objectives and killing some light infantry dead. Otherwise I think they're kind of okay transports, and maybe rank them tier 2 a bit more generically, but I think that we're going to see Truck Boys used quite a lot in Orky lists. Next up we come to the Kill Rig, still to be released at the moment. but it feels like Games Workshop are really wanting to sell these massive squig-drawn contraptions. They cost 190 points, but they excel in all kinds of areas. First up, fairly tough at toughness 8, 16 wounds, a 6+ invul and ramshackle, really quite fast with a 12-inch movement. They're probably the best place to get the Werboy Beasthead discipline powers, as the Werboy embarked on it can automatically cast 2 of them, so you're kind of getting a cycle with 2 casts for the 30 extra points that this upgrades from the Hunter rig. It's got a little bit of shooting, nothing enormously outstanding, but still combined with everything else it's pretty great. Its melee isn't to be underestimated, hitting on 3s with a bunch of quality attacks, those saw blades will do a lot of work, and then finally, as if that weren't enough, it has the Ground Shaker Shells stratagem, which allows you to slow down 1 enemy unit per turn for 1 command point if you target them with the heavy lobber. The amount of value that you get for this thing is absolutely insane, and I think it's kind of hard to go wrong with 1 or 2 of these charging down the centre of the table. I'm sure we'll see a fair few of them about once the kit is actually released. Next up, we come to my favourite of the Ork flyers in the mighty Dakajet. As flyers go, it's really quite cheap and expendable at 120 points, and this thing is an absolute go-to if you're running a speed war type list, as you can get 42 strength 6 and AP-2 shots on the turn that you call the speed war. Even hitting on 5s, that's going to leave a massive mark. You could easily be picking up a squad of light infantry with it every turn. Its durability really isn't too bad either, with 12 wounds and ramshackle. Seems pretty great to run alongside a whole bunch of buggies. For extra nastiness, either freebooters and bad moons can get a lot more out of it. Freebooters in particular could be really obscene, getting those massive amount of shots hitting on a 4+. Next we come to the Warbikers, who again are insanely improved compared with the previous decks. They're bikes, so they're very fast and they can auto-advance 6 inches, meaning that they can get incredibly long charge ranges with the War, and they're really quite tough on top of that, with toughness 5, 3 wounds and a native -1 to hit. If you go for Speed War, on the other hand, they can get 12 Dagger Gun shots, each at AP-1, so that's a pretty stupid 108 shots at Strength 5 AP-1 if you take a full squad of 9 for only 225 points. Again, they'll really love to be bad moons or freebooters, and they've even got pretty reasonable melee on top of all that. Again, it's very hard to go wrong with fast, tough, shooty and choppy. What's not to like? Perhaps one of their biggest competitors, though, are the Squighog boys. They don't get the -1 to hit that Warbikers do, but they do get toughness 6 and the 6+ invul for being beast snaggers. They're not quite as fast as the Warbikes, but are far scarier in melee, with 5 really quite quality melee attacks apiece, potentially wounding everything on the game on 4s if you field them as snakebites. Like Warbikes, maybe morale could be a bit of an issue, but a few small units of these don't seem like they're going to be very easy to go wrong with. They'll happily be picking up light enemy units every time they charge. Next up we come to Storm Boys, which I was tossing up a little bit between Tier 1 and Tier 2, but overall I decided to put them in Tier 1, mainly because of how useful they are for playing the mission, doing things like objectives and actions. For just 2 points more than your standard issue boys, you get a jump pack on them, and they get to advance 18 inches if they need to. It means that if you are running them in a war detachment, then you're going to get a crazy threat range on their advance and charge, potentially charging units reliably halfway across the table. They also have innate deep strike, which is no bad thing on a fairly cheap unit. It means that if all you want to do is do some retrieving Octarius data or other actions, you can pop them in deep strike and have them jump down and do an action, and then if they survive to charge something the next turn, then so much the better. In particular, I think the Death Skulls will really get on well with the Storm Boys, as it makes them obsec. In a very similar vein, I have included Ork Commandos here as well, and as I mentioned in a previous video on the channel, I think that they're pretty much an auto-include for competitive Ork lists right now. 10 points a model, so 50 points for a minimum sized mob. They get to set up in the midfield for a forward deployment, potentially getting first turn charges if they want to, but perhaps more importantly screening and move blocking the enemy, and getting right on those midfield objectives turn 1, potentially doing actions and things. I think that would easily be worth their points cost on their own, but they have a couple of really good advantages as well. If you can get them in light cover, then they get a +2 to their cover save, so they're actually going to be on a 3+ save against most enemy shooting. Really not bad on such a cheap toughness 5 unit. On top of that, their melee is just a little bit more scary than standard boys. They get +1 to wound with throat slitters, if you can get them into combat near area terrain. I'd see them as an advantage to your army as a whole, screening out enemy infiltrators themselves, and being a few extra points to seize the midfield before the game has even begun. Finally, I thought we'd round up with 2 of the strongest buggies around. First up we have the mighty Megatrak Scrapjet, which at 90 points seems to be the most efficient buggy for raw firepower. For your 90 points you get a mighty 7 rocket shots, plus a bunch of big shooters, so when taken en masse can just put out a scary barrage of anti-tank firepower, all on a relatively mobile platform that's fairly tough with ramshackle as well. On top of that, if the opponent overextends or there's some weakened enemy units nearby, they can charge as well. They have the chance to get mortal wound impact hits for D3 mortal wounds on a 4+, and then their actual melee is very nice too, striking at strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3. They'll really like certain clans such as Blood Axes for fallback and shoot, and Freebooters to fish for the +1 to hit, and it really seems that you could go pretty heavy on these, maybe the more the merrier, as then your opponent will struggle to deal with all of them. Finally, and again a unit that I've already covered in its own video, is the Rugged Truck Squig Buggy. Like the Scrapjet, it's a cheap and fast buggy with the ramshackle keyword, so it's fairly tough, and again you could certainly spam these guys for days and lay down a really effective amount of ignores line of sight shooting. The heavy Squig launcher chucks out 2d6 strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 shots, all hitting on a 4+, which I think is fairly impressive, never mind what the secondary weapons do. Taking a whole bunch of these can just act as a bit of a hoover, allowing you to put a crazy amount of hurt on the single enemy unit that's going to be messing with your battle plans the most, or anyone who's trying to score some sneaky objectives. Again, they'll love to be in speed wire for extra AP, and to top it off they even pack some melee threat, so if your opponent does manage to engage them in combat, they'll still be hitting back with some strength 7 saw blades. Again, I'd expect to see loads of them in the future, they're just a fun and efficient unit all round. And finally, last but not least, we come to the beast boss on Squigosaur, which might just be so strong that it deserves a tier all of its own. Again, I have made an entire video about this guy, but for the ridiculously low cost of 145 points, he is just enormously efficient as a fighty leader. He has 9 wounds with a 5+ invul and -1 damage built in, 8 quality melee attacks, 5 from his beast chopper, and then 3 from the Squigosaur's jaws. They get 3 mortal wounds if he wounds on a 6, so he's already pretty efficient at base. However, you can do all manner of strong builds with him. A lot of people seem to be going down the insanely durable route, making him -1 to wound and giving him a 5+ feel no pain with a beast hide mantle. That means small arms are going to be universally wounding him on 6s, and even things like las cannons will only be wounding him on 4s. -1 damage and a 5+ feel no pain is crazily tough to shift, as anyone who's tried to take down Mortarion will tell you. Otherwise though, you could go for the more damage dealing build, taking brutal but cunning to re-roll attacks that don't make it to the damage dealing step, and maybe taking a fighty relic such as Ed Whopper's Kill Chopper, which puts him up to a very nice strength 12 and gives him decent AP. Finally, you could stack that with either Goths for exploding 6s and +1 strength, Snake Bites for +1 to wound on the charge, or Evil Sons for a little bit of extra movement, plus Res Mecha's redder armor to allow enemy units nearby to fight last. This guy is just insanely brutal for the amount of points that he costs, and there is also the named character version Mozrog Scragbat for the Snake Bites as well, which you could consider as an alternative. He gets a damage 3 chopper, it's a bit harder to kill with a 4+ invul, though it does mean that you can't take the crazy stacked warlord traits and relics, so it is a bit of a trade-off. Again, these guys aren't out yet, but when they are, I strongly suspect that they'll be the war boss of choice, if you are wanting a war detachment that isn't a speed war. So that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Orks tier list then. Overall, I feel like most Ork units are at least fairly viable right now, but there just do seem to be a fair few that are really next level, and maybe do seem to outcompete other options within the Codex. It's going to be interesting to see what sort of lists and options people come up with. I'll certainly be keeping my eye on Orky lists that do well in tournaments going forward. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Orspec's Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention the Orspec's Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making new videos every single day does take a fair amount of time and effort, particularly big comparison ones like this, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.